I'm Dani Poole. I am focusing on predictive analytics this summer. My interest in data started at a young age. Since those early science fairs, I've really developed my focus on the use of data for improving public health worldwide. In the last year, I finished my PhD at Harvard and worked on developing a portfolio of different research projects in humanitarian contexts. Here at the center, I'm pulling together my background and training in data science with this experience in humanitarian contexts to really think about the challenges facing the use of predictive analytics in the humanitarian sector. And by predictive analytics, I'm talking about the use of statistical techniques to estimate a future event. So this is pretty simple. We're all familiar with the weather forecasts, which has been an ongoing phenomenon in our society since the 19th century. Our daily lives are embedded with predictive analytics too, while we're surfing the internet, shopping online, even shopping at a local grocery store. In humanitarian contexts, predictive analytics are used to foresee a shock, such as a famine or a population movement. With advance notice about a shock, this allows humanitarian actors to move from a reactive posture to a risk management approach with anticipatory action, ultimately achieving cost savings and saving lives. In April, the center convened a workshop around the use of predictive analytics for humanitarian action. And some of the overall goals of the workshop were to map out current initiatives in predictive analytics, what models are being built and by whom, as well as to understand the gaps and challenges facing the use of these models in the sector. A main takeaway from the workshop was a demand from the data scientists as well as humanitarian practitioners for a peer review process of the work and more transparency. This ground-up demand for the facilitation and communication of rigor around predictive analytics is really what drove the focus of my fellowship. So here at the center, I focused on how the center might do exactly this, facilitate and communicate rigor around the use of predictive analytics. In academia, peer review has a rich tradition of doing just this. But in the humanitarian sector, there's a slightly different bottom line, the humanitarian imperative. And this is the alleviation of suffering. So in addition to this rigor, we have some additional considerations to bake into the peer review process at the center. My approach to this problem first started with scoping what's existing in the literature, so what peer review models have been published in the academic literature. I also reviewed different peer review processes among different humanitarian organizations, as well as in academia and the private sector. I conducted about 20 in-depth interviews with different stakeholders to understand their perspectives about the development and use of models. And for example, one interviewee said to me, all models are useful and all models are wrong. And this really highlights a consensus around the stakeholders I spoke to about the need to really have a deeper appreciation for the reliability and other considerations necessary in the use of models. So based on these investigations, I developed a framework for peer review. There's 3 phases. It starts with the Readiness Assessment, which is initiated by the client. The client's an individual who's interested in having a model reviewed by the center, so because they'd like to use the output for decision making. Together, the client and a moderator at the center will discuss the model's readiness. So just a brief overview of what does the model entail and what supporting documentation might be available for review. And by that I mean code and methodological documentation. In the second phase, the moderator will invite 3 reviewers to look at the model. And this is unique to the process because in addition to the regular technical criteria that are evaluated in peer review, we've also added in an ethical review and a humanitarian relevance review. And then finally, the moderator will take the products of these 3 reviews and provide a recommendation. So let's delve a little bit more into this middle phase, the model review, which is where I focused most of my time. So in the technical domain, a data scientist or someone with statistical expertise would review the rigor and quality of the model. This is things like considering how the model was developed, how it was tested and then validated, where the data came from and its quality, and how the predictors and outputs were operationalized. In the ethical domain, someone with experience in humanitarian ethics and data responsibility would consider the types of risk and bias associated with the model. And then finally, in the humanitarian relevance domain, someone with experience, with a background in humanitarian decision-making and experience with the specific context where the model output would be applied, considers what is the feasibility of action based on the model outputs. So I'll just bring us in to an example that's pretty familiar right now. So let's consider a humanitarian crisis of a heat shock. And so we're imagining someone has a model predicting heat shock. And CERF, the Central Emergency Response Fund that's managed by OCHA, is interested in using this output in order to fund anticipatory action. So the first step would be that CERF would request that the center review the model. We want to know how rigorous the model is. This would be passed on to the 3 reviewers that I just mentioned. So in a technical review, the technical reviewer might look at something like, was the data used to build this model to predict a heat wave relevant to the geographical location where we're thinking about action? So was it from this region? The ethical reviewer would think about things like, what happens if the model's wrong? What happens if the model predicts a heat wave and one doesn't happen? So that would mean perhaps funding would be triggered, and then it would be a cost inefficiency. On the other hand, what happens if the model fails to predict a heat wave and one occurs? Then we could have significant human suffering and a failure to act. And then finally, someone with humanitarian experience in heat wave response would assess what is the actual feasibility of using this output for action. So for example, let's say the output of the model is you have a 1-week lead, so there could be the probability of a heat wave affecting a proportion of the population in 1 week. Is that enough time to trigger financing, and what action is actually possible in that time period? So these are the kinds of considerations that would be happening in the review phase. And then based on these reviews, the center would produce a recommendation to the client. In this case, it was the CERF. So in the true spirit of peer review, I can't resist mentioning a few limitations. So a couple barriers to this process working are a failure to uptake, people not interested in submitting models. Also, the models that are ready for review at the rigor that we're proposing here could be a barrier. And then finally, also just the speed at which humanitarian decision-making needs to happen. And that's why I'm recommending that the center use an iterative approach to really build up towards this gold standard process. And that includes things like pilot testing the process on our own work, also quantifying the impact of peer review informed decision-making to really drive demand, as well as sharing findings, best practices. And by doing that, I think the center has the lead role in governing the best practices in predictive analytics in the sector. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.